Football at 4, John McMullen, 97.3 ESPN.com. Follow him at JF McMullen every day at this time. We talk NFL and Eagles. Yesterday we talked a lot about the new rule changes, and we kind of dusted over the fact that Doug Pederson talked with reporters for over an hour at the coaches meeting breakfast during the league meetings out in Phoenix. Jeff Mosher, Mike Gill, and Jeff Mosher on Mike and Mosh Thursday, getting ready to talk a little football with Johnny Mack here, as the Phillies, by the way, are 1-1 in the bottom of the third. We'll keep you up to date on that here at the Wonder Bar in Atlantic City. Johnny Mack, welcome back.
Hey, guys, how are you? I think Andrew McCutchen is already on the Phillies Wall of Fame.
They've put guys with less credentials, I think, up there. in the past.
They probably have.
It's like, what was the guy's name? Paul Bird? Is he on there? No, I'm just kidding.
I don't think it's that bad. I think Mike Lieberthal is sort of the low bar.
The ceiling, the benchmark of what you need to be to get on that. By the way, McCutchen's back up the bat, so we'll keep you up to date. We talked a lot yesterday about the rules and the AAF stuff, which, the AAF stuff I think is fascinating. If the league kind of goes out of business here, they might not even play games this week. We'll see. But the Eagles head coach did speak, and, I was away, so we didn't really dive into this earlier in the week. But there's a lot that we can kind of pick on the bone from that conversation that he had with the reporters out there in Phoenix. And one was, the narrative that Carson Wentz needs to be a better teammate. I think that's something that probably would have gotten more play had there not been so much more going on right now.
Yeah, maybe. I think it all harkens back, obviously, to the Philly Voice piece, and Carson himself admitted during that other roundtable where they only invited certain reporters that there were certain things he could handle better, basically confirming the fact that some people don't like him. I don't think that's a news story. If you understand an NFL team has 53 players, you got 10 on the practice squad, you have another couple guys on injured reserve at any time, so you're talking anywhere from 70 maybe to 75 people. I don't know if you got any 70 people together that everybody would like everybody. And certainly a competitive personality like Carson Wentz has, I don't think it should be a surprise to anyone that he could rub someone the wrong way. He's a type A personality. A lot of us have reported this stuff numerous times. The only thing that new came out from that particular piece was actually some anonymous sources using some incendiary adjectives, but it is what it is. We saw, look what's going on in Pittsburgh with Ben Roethlisberger. I mean, that guy's already got 2 Super Bowls. He's going to the Hall of Fame. A lot of guys don't like him. And I'm not saying a lot of guys don't like Carson, because I think it's only a few, but that's not rare. And I would say that happens in every NFL locker room, and I think Jeff would probably agree with that.
You know what I thought was really interesting, John, was his choice of words and saying that Carson could afford to be a little bit more vulnerable, which is not something that any top athlete or competitor, and Doug having played with, under great coaches like Shula and Andy, and played with Brett Favre and some of the great quarterbacks, would actually say that. Surprised me. And on top of what you're saying, I felt like Doug didn't show the awareness that he could have of how difficult it is for someone like Carson Wentz to be able to reach across the aisle and to exert leadership at a time when he's spending so much time in the offseason and the summer on his own, doing the rehab, trying to get ready. Players talk all the time about how you can't be the same leader when you're in the trainer's room all the time and you're not on the field playing. And now it's almost like it's being held against Carson Wentz that he was reclusive and by himself during a time in which most athletes are.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. I mean, that's what rehab is. You're sort of on an island. You're part of the team, but you're not part of the team. And unfortunately, it becomes a bigger deal when you're the face of the team and the face of the franchise. And then part of it is that a lot of people like Nick as well. A lot of people like Nick Foles. So there's a natural comparison you have to make, and obviously they went on to win the Super Bowl, and we all know what happened last year when Nick came in and sort of rescued the season, got him back in the playoffs. So there's some natural inclination to be drawn toward him as well. I think that's part of it. But, I've heard a number of people bring up that word, vulnerable, and Doug using it. To me, when I listen to it, if you go back to Chip Kelly, he would say this was the coach's breakfast at the meetings was his annual dental exam. He hated it. You got to sit there for an hour.
They never get to eat. They got a big plate of food in front of them, and they never get the chance to
us.
eat. Yeah, well, I mean, I don't feel nobody should feel sorry for us.
So, and this goes for every press conference. I think people parse the words and like they're politicians, and you're not under oath. I mean, sometimes you're just going off the cuff, and you guys know from being on the radio, we all do it. Sometimes you say things, maybe it doesn't come out the way you intended it to come out. You mentioned Doug. I mean, Doug has a history with Brett Favre and Dan Marino. Those guys weren't exactly vulnerable. I think he meant it more of he could do a better job reaching out to certain teammates and communicating better. And so I didn't necessarily put an asterisk next to that word and put that much into it.
John McMullen, a lot on the Eagles offseason right now here on the Sports Bash. A lot of injuries that he kind of talked about. And I think the cornerback position, which was decimated by them last year, had a lot of the nuggets there. Jalen Mills, who, when he got hurt originally, there was like, he might be back in a couple of weeks, and then he was out for the season. He mentioned that he's going to be brought along slowly. It seems like that injury was a lot worse than maybe we thought at the time. And then, of course, there's Darby, who they bring back. He had the ACL. They got to bring him back. Sidney Jones didn't finish the year last year. Rasul Douglas is a guy that should be very interesting to watch. I'm interested to see what they do with him in year number 3, Avonte Maddox in year number 2. I think that the injuries in that defensive backfield last year makes this year a little bit stronger, but also very interesting in a couple of weeks here when they start to get to minicamp.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you're going to see – well, Ronald certainly is not going to do anything essentially in the OTAs that he rehabs from his ACL, but I don't think Jalen Mills is going to do anything either. He's still – in a walking boot. He was pictured in early March. He still had his walking boot on, so he had surgery on that foot. I think it's going to be a lost off season for both. They're both going to be rehabbing, and that makes things in the spring really important for Rasul Douglas and Sidney Jones because they're going to get a lot of looks. They're going to be the first-team corners on the outside in off-season work, and that's obviously an opportunity to catch the coaching staff's eye. Now, there's not a lot you can do in the off season. Let's be honest. There's no contact, obviously. There's no press coverage or anything of that nature. But nonetheless, you kind of saw it with Nelson Agholor a couple years ago when he started his ascension after such a bad start to his career. He had a great offseason. I think that's what you want to see from Sidney Jones specifically because he's got so much talent. I think he needs to start moving in the right direction. But this team is very deep at the cornerback position now, and that's good because, as you mentioned, last year, injuries tend to pile up at that position. You can never have enough bodies at that position. And now the Eagles are pretty well fortified.
We definitely saw it last year, and you wrote that Pederson sounded excited about the addition of Andrews and Dejo at safety, which we can kind of talk a little bit more and see what his role will be, and the versatility of Maddox at that position. But you wrote, don't kid yourself, Maddox, Mills, and Douglas, for that matter, are cornerbacks in the team's eye. So Maddox is a guy that how are they going to use him? You think it will be at corner, which means that corner, gets a lot more competition. But Maddox, Douglas, a lot of people keep waiting for them to move them to safety. That doesn't seem to be happening. But Zendejo, does he fill that Graham role? And then, of course, you got Rodney McLeod, who's coming off a pretty big injury at safety.
Yeah, he is, and I think, projected, you put it in pencil that Sendejo is going to fit into that Corey Graham third safety role, and that's very important in Jim Schwartz's defense, and it's getting even more important as this game continues to shift to more of a sub-package type environment on the defensive side of the football. And anytime he feels comfortable moving Malcolm Jenkins around, that's a good thing for this defense. When they play big nickel or dime, whatever you want to call it, that creates a lot of headaches for the opposing offense. And when you have a versatile player like Malcolm Jenkins and you have the confidence to move him around the chessboard, it makes you better. And when they didn't feel that way for a long period last year when Corey was injured, they didn't have that much confidence in Trey Sullivan. And you saw this team, and they also had the young corners playing. So you had to play it safer, play more zone, and that's what Jim did, and I give him a lot of credit for scheming things. But this is a better defense when Malcolm moves around, and at least on paper, I mean, Sendejo is part of a top 5 defense as a starter 3 different times. So people will look at the NFC Championship game, and he didn't play well here. None of the Vikings did, but he's got a lot of experience, and you could tell Doug's excited about getting him in the building.
One of the things I wonder, though, John, is then what becomes of Avonte Maddox? I mean, and listen, I know that it'll all come out in the wash. Things will get settled way, months and months from now. But in bringing back some of these guys like Ronald Darby and then signing Andrew Sendejo, they gave themselves great depth. But I do wonder now how it all shakes out. I mean, Sidney Jones is a second-round pick. I think it's safe to say that if he can't get on the field this year, that becomes a terrible pick. I think they want him to get on the field. I would think that they would want him to start opposite Ronald Darby, who they just re-signed, but they played well with Maddox and Douglas last year. And if Maddox doesn't win a starting corner job, then you'd think his youth and his playmaking ability and what he showed last year would be nice for that role that they have theoretically signed Andrew Sendejo for. They've got a lot of bodies, and not everybody's going to make this team. I feel like there's going to be some kind of surprises by the time this whole thing shakes out.
Yeah, well, at corner, you're 6 deep if you add Crevan LeBlanc to the mix, and he played well as well down the stretch last season. But I think as we saw last year, I think you want 6 corners, and I think they're very happy that they have 6 corners. I think you're right. They want Sidney Jones, and that's why this spring will be very important to them. They want him to push both outside guys, Ronald Darby and Jalen Mills. But we know how much Jim Schwartz likes Jalen Mills. It's a lot more than a fan base, let's put it that way. They think Darby's their best corner, and I think they want Maddox to start in the slot. That's where they want him. That's what they drafted him as slot corner. That's his best role, and that's ultimately where I think he's going to end up. And then you have LeBlanc as depth and pushing him there.
So if Sidney Jones has a good camp, what do you do with this guy? You know what I'm saying?
That's the same exact question that was formulating in my head.
I'll be honest with you. I was not a big fan of bringing Ronald Darby back. I think that his skill set, what he does well, is not what Jim Schwartz's corners have done since Jim Schwartz has been here. I think he plays poorer when he's asked to give more space and play off the ball than when he's allowed to get up on a guy and play tighter coverage, which was supposed to be his calling card. So it confused me that they spent the money to bring him back.
But don't you think Schwartz would have to be in on the conversation?
Yes, that's what I don't understand. I mean, I get he's. Go ahead, John.
If Ronald didn't hurt himself and he got to free agency at his age, he was probably going to get in that 12, 13 million annual range. Sure. I don't think he would be back. The fact that the injury knocked his value down, I think the Eagles saw an opportunity to be smart and keep a talented player. And from his standpoint, understand he's still rehabbing that ACL. So if he goes to a new team, he's not going to have an off season in a new defense. So it would hurt him as well.
Yeah.
It would hurt him as well. So now he can go on the open market again next year if he's completely healthy. But from the Eagles' perspective, as I said, just keeping a talented player. And you want Sidney Jones to push, as I said, more likely than not Jalen Mills. I get what you're saying about Jim, but Jim is more malleable than people give him credit for. And the fact that he had a lot of off coverage last year, which is completely true, is because he didn't have confidence in the man-to-man coverage ability of his corners. In theory, if Darby's healthy, if Sidney Jones lives up to what he's supposed to be, he would have two corners that could cover, and I think you would see things change. But I don't think he has that same kind of confidence in the press coverage ability of Jalen Mills, even though he likes him as a player, and somebody like Rasul Douglas, who's more of a traditional zone corner.
So, Mills is always the guy that everybody picked on, like, get him out of there. But do they view him higher up the depth chart than a second-round pick, Sidney Jones, that many people thought would have been a first-round pick had he not been hurt? Where does Sidney kind of fit in on, and then you got Maddox, too. So last year people thought, well, maybe Sidney, you have Mills and Darby, and then Sidney would be the slot guy, but that never really he wasn't very good in that role. So is Maddox ahead of Jones? Is Mills ahead of Sidney Jones? Is he kind of just like, you look back at them when they took him?
Yeah. As I said, right now, as you go into the offseason, you don't have to worry about moving parts, and you just sort of pencil things in. And right now they consider the outside corner to be Darby and Mills, who are both going to be rehabbing, backed up by Douglas and Jones. Douglas would be on the right side, Sidney on the left side. The nickel slot would be Avonte Maddox, backed up by Cre'Von LeBlanc. But we all know as injuries start to factor in, and that's where Jim values the versatility. And it's comforting to know that somebody like Avonte Maddox, despite his size limitations, proved he can play outside if he has to. It's comforting to know he proved to play he could safety as a center fielder if he has to. But it's just a matter of they think his best position long-term is nickel cornerback. And I don't necessarily disagree with that.
John McMullen talking Eagles and NFL with us here on the Sports Bash, 97.3 ESPN. We are live at the Wonder Bar in Atlantic City, so stop on out. A lot of people have been entering to win tickets to see the sold-out Vans Warped Tour on the beach in Atlantic City. So if you're interested in those tickets, they are sold out. We have them here today. He talked about the receivers, and I thought this was interesting in your notes, John, at 97.3ESPN.com. They got Deshaun Jackson here. He's obviously going to be a big difference maker. I saw that you tweeted last night that, they might be open to taking some calls on Nelson Agholor, but he also mentioned Braxton Miller ahead of guys like Matt Collins and Shelton Gibson, and I don't even know that people know that Braxton Miller's on the team.
Yeah, people tend to forget the practice squad guys. And remember, Braxton was a third-round pick, obviously a quarterback at Ohio State. So he was a pretty valuable draft choice in Houston at one time. So he's got some physical skill. And I thought, maybe it was something that Doug sort of, when he was asked about the receiver position, that's in the young players, that's the first name that came out of his mouth. Sometimes you're subconscious in that type of atmosphere. And that might say something. I keep hearing Nelson Agholor about potential trades. And Corey Clement as well, but look, the Eagles have a lot of money tied up into the receiver position right now, projected to be. I'm not saying they're peddling Nelson Agholor, but I think they would be taking calls all the way up to the draft. Ultimately, I thought they would try to work out an extension to lower his cap number for this year. That's still a possibility. Maybe they let him play out his contract. But it looks to me like there's still some smoke to that fire. And you look at what Doug says, and maybe a guy like Braxton Miller, maybe he's part of that equation. Matt Collins obviously missed last season. Shelton Gibson, they're draft picks. And they should be on the tip of Doug's tongue, but they're not. It was Braxton Miller.
Well, what's interesting, John, and I'll take it a step further, and I think this probably perked yours up too. I agree with you. I think Agholor, not only up to the draft, but maybe even through training camp, will be on the block because we've seen Howie make deals for guys coming at the end of their contract, like with Jordan Matthews a couple of years ago. But Doug saying at the breakfast that he really has looked at a lot of tape and explored how to get even more 12 personnel and Dallas Goedert on the field is another indication that Nelson would be shaky, because obviously if you're going to play two tight ends and put Ertz in the slot and have Goddard in line and maybe alternate it for creativity, what you're doing is taking your slot receiver off and de-emphasizing that role. And so now you got $9.5 million committed to a role you're de-emphasizing. It again keeps that flame going of maybe they really would move Nelson if they had the right opportunity.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. I said last week, I mean, it's hard to say Dallas Goedert is better, a better football player than Nelson Agholor at this stage, but I certainly think he has the potential to be. I certainly think the Eagles believe he's headed in that direction. And at the end of the day, you want your best players on the field. Even though Doug would prefer to use 11, the Eagles were better late last season in 12 personnel, two tight ends, because Dallas Goedert's really good. So I said that from early when they brought in Deshaun Jackson. I said, boy, you're not going to have Dallas Goedert on the field? That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So, yeah, I'm with you 100% on that. I think ultimately, in fact, I'll say it right now, I don't think it's 80-20, but I would say it's 51-49 at least that Nelson Agholor isn't on this team come September.
Let me ask you this then. If you're Howie Roseman and you're putting Nelson out there, are you looking for a position of need in return or just a draft choice? Because last year when they traded Jordan Matthews, they traded for Darby.
If you're trading him in training camp, then it's a draft choice, most likely.
Well, they traded Matthews. They got Darby back in return.
That's a good point. That's a good point.
And also, Nelson's contract prohibits a ton of value coming back unless the team he's going to works out a longer-term extension. I mean, 9 point whatever it is, $3 or $4 million. That's a lot of money for a slot receiver in this league. So I think that's part of the problem when you talk about trading Nelson Agholor. I don't know. People say that's a pretty effective receiver. You should be able to get something of value for him. That contract complicates the matters and makes things more difficult.
Yeah, the funny thing real quick on that is that I agree, John, but I think the way the market went this offseason, a lot of those slot receivers wind up signing for about $9.5 million. There were about 3 or 4 guys who were slot receivers that signed for that number.
Yeah, and it is becoming a position that's more valuable. Guys like Jarvis Landry obviously went well above that, and I think people are putting more value on the position and willing to go higher for a dominant player. But I also don't think Nelson is a dominant player. I just think he's a good slot receiver. I don't think he's in the category of the great slot receivers. Maybe he has the potential to get there. Certainly has great athleticism. Just hasn't been consistent enough catching the football. But if you work out a longer-term extension, remember, these are the kind of guys that tend to cash in on free agency. Coming off your first contract, you're in that sweet spot of 25, 26, and people will give you a little bit more money based on potential rather than production. So, hey, if the Eagles want to move them, they'll be able to move them.
John McMullen, a lot on the offense today. Tomorrow we'll zone in on some of the things Doug had to say about the defense, including Michael Bennett getting traded to New England. That's all still to come with Football at 4. John McMullen here on the Sports Bash, of course, every day at 4 o'clock. We talk NFL. John, you should see our view right now. We are looking at the Bay and watching the Phillies game. It's pretty pristine.
That's nice because I am looking at ripped up asphalt as we speak. So that's better.
Nice.
That's like a metaphor for John's life right there.
There you go.
Oh, thanks, Ken. I appreciate it.
Oh, man.
I love you, buddy.
All right, pal. Take care. John McMullen at JF McMullen on Twitter, co-host of the Mosher,
Yes.
McMullen, and Krause
I
show.
should have said demeanor, not his life, but that's John. He's a salt of the earth guy. He
I'll
tells
tell
it
you.
like it is.